The cold barrel of a shotgun pressed against Thalia Dawson's temple as her brother uttered the words that shattered her world. She's yours now. Debt paid in full. The year was 1878, and in the unforgiving Arizona territory, a woman's fate could change hands as easily as a deck of cards. The saloon fell silent as Thalia stood trembling beside her brother Vernon, her hands bound with rough rope that bit into her wrists. Her cotton dress, once white and pristine, now bore the dust and grime of their 3-day journey from their failing homestead to this godforsaken town called Redemption. "I said I wanted my money, not your sister," growled Silas Blackwood, the notorious saloon owner and loan shark who held Vernon's gambling debts. His eyes, cold as a rattlesnake's, raked over Thalia's form with calculated assessment. "But I reckon she might fetch a fair price down in Mexico." Thalia fought back tears. Just 21 years old, and her own flesh and blood had traded her away like cattle. Since their parents' death from fever 2 winters ago, Vernon had spiraled into gambling and drink, squandering what little they had managed to save. "Please," she whispered, though she knew pleading would do no good. Not with men like these. The saloon doors swung open, letting in a shaft of blinding desert sunlight and the silhouette of a tall figure. Boots struck the wooden floor with purpose as the newcomer approached, spurs jangling with each deliberate step. "That's not how we do business in Redemption anymore, Blackwood." The voice was deep, steady as bedrock, and carried the weight of authority. As Thalia's eyes adjusted to the light, she saw him clearly. A tall cowboy with eyes the color of a summer storm and a Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The star pinned to his leather vest caught the lamplight. The Sheriff of Redemption. "Stay out of this, Justice," Blackwood snapped. "This is a private transaction." Sheriff Yorick Justice removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with dust from the trail. His gaze moved from Blackwood to Vernon, and finally rested on Thalia. Something in his expression softened when their eyes met. "There's nothing private about human trading," Justice said, his voice dangerously quiet. He stepped closer, positioning himself between Thalia and Blackwood. "Let the lady go." Blackwood's men, 3 rough-looking gunslingers, tensed, hands hovering near their weapons. The air in the saloon crackled with tension. "She's payment for a debt fair and square," Blackwood insisted. "Her brother owes me $500. The sheriff didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. He tossed it onto the table with a heavy clink of coins. $500, he stated. "Debt paid." Blackwood's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you pay another man's debt, Sheriff?" Justice's gaze never left Thalia's face as he answered. "Because she's worth more than gold to me." The saloon erupted in whispers. Thalia felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She had never seen this man before in her life. Yet here he was, stepping into the role of her savior. Blackwood hesitated, then reached for the pouch, weighing it in his palm before nodding to one of his men. "Cut her loose." As the rough rope fell away from Thalia's wrists, Sheriff Justice extended his hand to her. "Miss, if you'd come with me." Vernon stepped forward, suddenly indignant. "Now wait just a minute. If you're buying her debt, that money should go to me. She's my sister." In one swift motion, Justice had Vernon by the collar, lifting him nearly off his feet. "You forfeited any right to call her family when you put a price on her head," he growled. "Get out of my town by sundown, or I'll have you in a cell for trafficking." He released Vernon, who stumbled backward, clutching at his throat. The sheriff turned to Thalia, his expression gentling. "My office is just down the street. You'll be safe there." Confused, frightened, but with few options, Thalia followed the sheriff out of the saloon, keenly aware of the eyes following their exit. The bright Arizona sun momentarily blinded her as they stepped outside. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Justice slowed his stride to match hers. "Because what your brother did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. And I don't allow such things in my town." "But you don't know me," Thalia persisted. $500 is. It's a fortune." The sheriff stopped walking and turned to face her. "Miss Dawson, it is Dawson, correct?" She nodded, surprised he knew her name. "Miss Dawson, I've been tracking your brother for 3 days. Word reached me that he was heading to Redemption with a young woman in tow, aiming to settle a debt with Blackwood. I know his type. Once a man starts betting with things that aren't his to wager, There's no bottom to how low he'll sink. Thalia felt a surge of shame. I had no idea he was in such debt. Our farm is nearly foreclosed on, I imagine. Justice finished for her. Men like your brother leave a trail of destruction. But that's not your burden to carry. They reached a modest building with sheriff's office, painted on a wooden sign above the door. Inside was simple but clean, a desk covered with papers, 3 cells along the back wall, all empty, and a small stove in the corner with a pot of coffee brewing. Sit, please, Justice said, indicating a chair. You must be exhausted. Thalia sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how her entire body ached from the journey and the strain of her ordeal. What happens now? She asked. The sheriff poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the desk to her. That depends on you, Miss Dawson. Do you have family elsewhere you could go to? She shook her head. No one. Our parents died 2 years ago. It was just Vernon and me trying to keep the farm going. Justice nodded thoughtfully. Redemption's a growing town. We have a boarding house for respectable women run by Mrs. Fincher. She's always looking for help with cooking and cleaning. It's honest work that comes with room and board. I could put in a word for you. Hope flickered in Thalia's chest for the first time that day. You would do that? I would. He took a sip of his coffee. But first, you should rest. There's a small room in the back where I sometimes sleep when work keeps me late. It's yours for today. Tomorrow, we'll visit Mrs. Fincher. Thalia studied the sheriff's face, the strong jawline, the slight crease between his eyebrows that spoke of concerns beyond her own troubles, the sincerity in his storm-gray eyes. In a world where her own brother had sold her to cover his debts, this stranger's kindness was almost too much to comprehend. Thank you, Sheriff Justice, she said softly. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. A hint of a smile touched his lips. You can start by calling me Yorick. And there's nothing to repay. Just get some rest. As Thalia followed him to the small back room with its narrow but clean bed, she couldn't help but wonder about this enigmatic lawman who had declared her worth more than gold. She wondered if he said such things to all the damsels in distress who crossed his path, or if there was something more to his words than simple gallantry. The room was sparse but tidy, with a small window overlooking the town's main street. Yorick Justice lingered at the doorway. I'll be at my desk if you need anything. The door locks from the inside. He hesitated, then added, I promise you're safe here, Miss Dawson. For the first time since her brother had bound her wrists and forced her onto his wagon 3 days ago, Thalia felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She closed the door softly after the sheriff departed, turned the lock, and finally allowed herself to weep, not just for the brother who had betrayed her, but for the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had given her hope when all seemed lost. Outside, Sheriff Justice settled at his desk, pulling out a wanted poster with Vernon Dawson's face crudely sketched upon it. The charges listed were fraud, theft, and assault, nothing about human trafficking until now. He hadn't told Thalia the full truth about her brother. Vernon Dawson wasn't just a gambling man with bad debts. He was a known criminal who had left a trail of broken lives across 3 territories. Justice added notes to the poster, detailing the latest offense. He would send riders out tomorrow to alert neighboring towns. Vernon Dawson wouldn't get far, not if Yorick had anything to say about it. As he worked, his thoughts kept returning to the woman sleeping in his back room. There was something about Thalia Dawson that stirred protective instincts he'd thought long buried. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity she maintained even in her darkest hour, or the flash of intelligence in her eyes that told him she was a survivor. Whatever it was, Sheriff Yorick Justice knew his life in redemption had just become considerably more complicated. The next morning, Thalia awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The events of the previous day came rushing back: Vernon's betrayal, the terrifying moment in the saloon, and the unexpected intervention of Sheriff Justice. She sat up, pushing tangled auburn hair from her face, and noticed a folded dress on the chair beside the bed, along with a small bundle that proved to contain soap, a comb, and a clean towel. A note in a firm, masculine hand read, Miss Dawson, these belong to Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress. She was kind enough to lend them when I explained your situation. There's hot water for washing behind the screen in the corner. Take your time. YJ, touched by the thoughtfulness, Thalia made use of the washing facilities, grateful to remove the dirt of travel and the feeling of Blackwood's appraising gaze from her skin. The borrowed dress was a simple blue calico, slightly large but clean and whole. She did her best with her hair, using the comb to tame it into a neat braid. When she emerged from the back room, Sheriff Justice was at his desk, a stack of papers before him and a fresh pot of coffee steaming on the small stove. He looked up at her entrance, and something flickered in his expression surprise, perhaps, at the transformation a bit of soap and clean clothing had wrought. "Good morning, Miss Dawson," he said, rising from his chair. "I trust you slept well." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you for the dress and washing things." He nodded. "Hungry? Mrs. Miller at the cafe sends over breakfast for prisoners, but seeing as I don't have any at the moment, it seems a shame to let it go to waste." He indicated a covered tray on a small table by the window. Lifting the cloth, Thalia found a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and biscuits still warm from the oven. Her stomach growled embarrassingly in response. "Please, eat," Justice encouraged. "We can talk while you do." As Thalia ate, trying to maintain some decorum despite her hunger, the sheriff explained his plan. "Mrs. Fincher is expecting us at 10. The boarding house is respectable, and the work isn't too demanding. Room and board plus $2 a week." Thalia nearly choked on her biscuit. $2 a week? That's very generous. Redemption's growing. Good help is hard to find. He paused, watching her carefully. "There's something else you should know, Miss Dawson. Your brother. He's wanted in several territories." Thalia set down her fork. "Wanted? For what?" "Fraud, primarily. Theft. Assault in one case." Justice's expression was grave. "I've sent word to neighboring towns to be on the lookout for him. I thought you should know." Thalia closed her eyes briefly. Part of her had held on to the hope that Vernon's actions were a desperate anomaly, not part of a pattern. "Will he hang if they catch him?" "No," Justice said firmly. "His crimes aren't capital offenses. But he'll serve time." She nodded slowly, processing this. "I suppose I should have known. He changed after our parents died. Became secretive, angry. Started disappearing for weeks at a time." She looked up at the sheriff. "I thought he was just grieving in his own way." "Grief makes people do strange things," Justice acknowledged. "But it doesn't excuse selling your sister to pay a gambling debt." His bluntness was oddly comforting. There was no pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact assessment that helped Thalia see her situation clearly. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." After breakfast, they walked the short distance to Mrs. Fincher's boarding house, a neat two-story building with white curtains in the windows and a small garden out front. The sheriff's presence at her side drew curious glances from townspeople, but he seemed oblivious to the attention. Mrs. Fincher proved to be a plump, energetic woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes that assessed Thalia thoroughly. "So you're the young lady Sheriff Justice mentioned," she said, ushering them into a tidy parlor. "Terrible business with your brother. Simply terrible. But you'll find Redemption to be a law-abiding town, mostly thanks to our sheriff here." The interview was brief, but thorough. Mrs. Fincher asked about Thalia's experience with housekeeping, cooking, and laundry, all skills she had honed on the family farm. By the end, it was settled. Thalia would have a small room on the second floor, meals with the other boarders, and would help with cooking, cleaning, and laundry 6 days a week. "You can start tomorrow," Mrs. Fincher said. "That will give you time to settle in and get some proper clothes. Can't have you working in a borrowed dress." When they left the boarding house, Thalia felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. "She seems formidable," she remarked. Justice chuckled. "Mrs. Fincher runs a tight ship, but she's fair. She'll look after you." He hesitated, then added, "There's a general store down the street. You'll need some essentials. I took the liberty of setting up an account for you there." Thalia stopped walking. "Sheriff Justice Yorick, you've already done too much." "I can't accept. Consider it in advance on your wages," he interrupted. "You can pay it back when you're settled." She studied his face, trying to understand his motivations. "Why are you helping me? And please don't say it's just because it's your job." A moment of silence stretched between them. Finally, he said, 10 years ago, I was new to wearing this badge. There was a young woman, not much older than you, brought to town by a man who claimed to be her husband. He sold her to the brothel at the edge of town before riding out. By the time I learned what had happened, He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I was too late to help her. I swore I'd never let that happen again in my town." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within Thalia. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It was a long time ago," he replied, his expression closing off slightly. "Now let's get you those supplies." The general store was overwhelming after the simplicity of farm life. With Justice's quiet guidance, Thalia selected practical items: 2 work dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, stockings, and basic toiletries. The store owner, Mr. Guthrie, was polite but clearly curious about her relationship with the sheriff. "Sheriff Justice doesn't usually escort young ladies on shopping expeditions," he remarked as he wrapped her purchases. "Miss Dawson is new to town," Justice said firmly. "She'll be working for Mrs. Fincher at the boarding house." Mr. Guthrie's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Well, welcome to Redemption, Miss Dawson. I'm sure you'll find it a pleasant change from wherever you came from." Back on the street, packages in hand, Thalia couldn't help but notice the curious glances from passers-by. "I think I'm causing quite a stir," she murmured. Justice shrugged. "Small town. News travels fast. By dinner, everyone will know you're working for Mrs. Fincher, and they'll find something else to gossip about." "And what will they be saying about you?" Thalia asked boldly. "The sheriff who paid $500 for a stranger?" A corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile. "They'll say I've finally lost my mind, most likely." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Thalia was struck by how quickly her life had changed. Yesterday, she had been a prisoner, bound and sold by her own brother. Today, she walked freely down the main street of Redemption with new clothes and the prospect of honest work. And beside her walked the man who had made it all possible, a man she knew almost nothing about, yet who had risked his life and spent a small fortune to save hers. Sheriff Yorick Justice was an enigma, and despite the dangers she had just escaped, Thalia found herself curious to solve the puzzle he presented. Little did she know that the coming weeks would test them both in ways neither could imagine, as the past she thought she'd left behind came galloping back with a vengeance. The next few days passed in a blur of new routines and faces as Thalia adjusted to life at Mrs. Fincher's boarding house. The work was demanding but not unfamiliar, rising before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the 12 boarders, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, and assisting with dinner preparations. Mrs. Fincher ran her establishment with military precision, but she was fair and even occasionally kind, slipping Thalia an extra piece of pie or sending her out for a break when she noticed her flagging. The other residents of the boarding house were mostly respectable working women: 2 schoolteachers, a telegrapher, the milliner's assistant, and several others who worked in the various shops around Redemption. They welcomed Thalia with varying degrees of warmth, but all were curious about her connection to Sheriff Justice. "He's never shown such interest in a newcomer before," remarked Miss Penelope Harper, the younger of the 2 schoolteachers, as they sat on the porch one evening after dinner. "And $500. That's nearly a year's salary for him." Thalia concentrated on her mending, uncomfortable with the topic. "He was just doing his job." "Sheriff Justice does his job admirably," said Miss Harper. "But paying a woman's debts goes well beyond the call of duty." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They say he hasn't courted anyone since his fiancée died 5 years ago." "Penelope," admonished Miss Wilkins, the older teacher. "That's hardly appropriate conversation." "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Miss Harper replied, unabashed. "The sheriff saved Miss Dawson like a knight in shining armor. It's romantic." Thalia felt her cheeks warm. "There's nothing romantic about it. He would have done the same for anyone in trouble." Yet despite her protests, Thalia found her thoughts returning to Sheriff Justice more often than she cared to admit. She had seen him only twice since moving to the boarding house, once when he stopped by to check on her progress, and again when they passed on the street as she was running errands for Mrs. Fincher. Both times, he had been polite but reserved, tipping his hat and asking after her welfare in that deep, steady voice that somehow made her feel both unsettled and secure. On her first Sunday in Redemption, Mrs. Fincher insisted that all the boarding house residents attend church services. "Appearances matter in a town this size," she explained as they walked toward the white clapboard building at the end of Main Street. "A young woman without family needs to be above reproach." The church was nearly full when they arrived, and Thalia felt the weight of curious stares as she followed Mrs. Fincher to a pew near the middle. She kept her eyes down, focusing on smoothing her dress, her best one, purchased with her first week's wages until a familiar figure in the side pew caught her attention. Sheriff Justice sat alone, his usually rumpled appearance transformed by a clean black suit and neatly combed hair. He caught her glance and nodded slightly in acknowledgement, the ghost of a smile touching his lips before he returned his attention to Reverend Simmons. The service passed in a blur for Thalia, her mind wandering despite her best efforts to focus on the sermon about forgiveness and redemption topics that struck uncomfortably close to home given her brother's betrayal. Afterward, as the congregation filed out into the bright Sunday sunshine, Thalia found herself separated from Mrs. Fincher in the crowd. A hand touched her elbow lightly, and she turned to find Sheriff Justice beside her. "Miss Dawson," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You're looking well. Settled in at Mrs. Fincher's, I trust?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of her plain dress and simple hairstyle next to the elegantly attired ladies of redemption. "The work suits me. I'm glad to hear it." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you on a walk. The weather's fine, and there's a matter I'd like to discuss with you." Thalia glanced around, spotting Mrs. Fincher deep in conversation with Reverend Simmons. "I should ask Mrs. Fincher. I've already spoken with her," Justice said. "She's agreed to spare you for an hour or so." Intrigued and a little concerned by his serious tone, Thalia nodded. "Then I'd be pleased to accompany you, Sheriff." They walked in silence for a few minutes, heading away from the church and toward the outskirts of town where the buildings gave way to open country. Justice seemed to be gathering his thoughts, and Thalia was content to wait, enjoying the warm sunshine and the brief respite from her duties. Finally, he spoke. "I've had news about your brother." Thalia's steps faltered. "He's been caught." "Not exactly." Justice frowned. "He was spotted in Silverado, about 50 miles west of here. He was asking questions about you." A chill ran through Thalia, despite the warm day. "What kind of questions?" "About where you might be staying. Whether you were alone." The sheriff's expression darkened. "The marshal there recognized him from the wanted poster I circulated and sent word to me. Vernon left town before they could apprehend him." "But why would he be looking for me?" Thalia asked, genuinely puzzled. "He sold me to pay his debt. He has no reason to want me back." Justice stopped walking and turned to face her. "I believe your brother may have gotten himself into even deeper trouble. The type of men he owes money to don't take kindly to being cheated. And you think he might try to use me somehow. I think he might see you as valuable in some way, either to sell again or to use as leverage." Justice's eyes were serious. "Which is why I wanted to warn you to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, especially after dark. And if you see Vernon or have any reason to believe he's nearby, come to me immediately." Thalia nodded, her mind racing. The idea that Vernon might still pose a threat hadn't occurred to her. She had been so focused on building her new life and redemption that she'd pushed thoughts of her brother aside. "There's something else you should know," Justice continued, his voice gentler now. "The loan shark your brother was dealing with, Silas Blackwood, he left town the day after our encounter. My deputy in the next county over reports that he's been asking about both you and me. So I've put you in danger as well," Thalia said, distress evident in her voice. "No," Justice said firmly. "I've been dealing with men like Blackwood my entire career. This is nothing new." He touched her arm lightly. "But I want you to understand that until we locate your brother in Blackwood, there's a certain amount of risk." They resumed walking, Thalia's thoughts churning with this new information. After a moment, she asked, "Is that why you paid my brother's debt? Because you knew what kind of man he was?" Justice was quiet for so long that Thalia thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Partly. But the truth is, when I walked into that saloon and saw you standing there, something—" He shook his head slightly. "I can't explain it. I just knew I couldn't let anything happen to you." The simple honesty in his voice made Thalia's heart beat faster. She looked up at him, studying his profile as he gazed out at the landscape. In that moment, he seemed both strong and vulnerable, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming gratitude that of all the lawmen who might have walked into that saloon, it had been Yorick Justice. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for paying the debt, but for telling me the truth now. For treating me like someone capable of handling it." He turned to her with a hint of surprise. "You're one of the strongest people I've met, Miss Dawson. You've endured betrayal that would break most folks, yet here you are, building a new life with dignity and grace. His words warmed her more than they should have. I haven't had much choice, she admitted. When there's no way back, the only option is to move forward. A philosophy I share, he said with a small smile. They had reached a hilltop overlooking Redemption. The town spread out below them like a child's playset, neat rows of buildings, the church steeple rising above them, wisps of smoke from chimneys curling into the blue sky. It's beautiful from up here, Thalia remarked. It is, Justice agreed. I come here sometimes when I need to think. Helps to see the whole picture. And what do you see when you look at Redemption, Sheriff? He considered the question seriously. I see a place trying to become something better than its past. This town was built on silver mines and cattle, with all the lawlessness that comes with sudden wealth. There was a time when a girl in your situation would have had only one place to go for work. He nodded toward a cluster of buildings on the far edge of town, the area Thalia had been warned to avoid. But Redemption's changing. Families are putting down roots. There's a school, a church. People want something more permanent than the next big strike or cattle drive. And you're helping to make that happen, Thalia observed. He shrugged. I'm just trying to keep the peace. The real change comes from folks like Mrs. Fincher, the Reverend, the school teachers, people building community. You're too modest, Sheriff. From what I've heard, Redemption was a very different place before you pinned on that star. A shadow crossed his face. I've made my share of mistakes. Lost people I should have protected. Thalia sensed he was thinking of the woman he'd mentioned before, the one he'd been too late to save. Impulsively, she touched his arm. You saved me. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a current of understanding and connection that transcended words. For a breathless moment, Thalia thought he might reach for her hand, or perhaps say something to acknowledge the growing attraction she felt sure wasn't one-sided. Instead, he cleared his throat and glanced at the position of the sun. We should head back. Mrs. Fincher will be wondering where you've gotten to. The spell broken, Thalia nodded and fell into step beside him as they descended the hill toward town. The conversation turned to lighter topics: the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, the new merchandise at the general store, Mrs. Fincher's legendary apple pie. By the time they reached the boarding house, Thalia's concerns about her brother had receded somewhat, pushed aside by the pleasure of Justice's company and the way he made her feel valued, respected, and perhaps, if she dared to hope, something more. Thank you for the walk and the warning, Sheriff, she said as they paused at the gate. I'll be vigilant. See that you are, he replied, his tone serious once more. And Thalia. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her. My door is always open if you need anything, day or night. With that, he tipped his hat and turned to go, leaving Thalia to face Mrs. Fincher's knowing smile and the speculative glances of the other boarders who had witnessed their return from the parlor window. Whatever dangers might be approaching, Thalia realized she no longer faced them alone, and that knowledge gave her a courage she hadn't felt since long before her brother's betrayal. 2 weeks passed without incident, and Thalia fell into the rhythm of life in Redemption. The work at Mrs. Fincher's was demanding but satisfying, and she found unexpected pleasure in the small community of women at the boarding house. They shared stories in the evenings as they sewed or read, and Thalia gradually opened up about her past, the happy years on the farm with her parents, the struggles after their death, and finally, Vernon's descent into gambling and his ultimate betrayal. The women listened with sympathy but without pity, which Thalia appreciated. They offered practical advice and, more importantly, friendship that helped fill the void left by her shattered family. Sheriff Justice became a regular visitor to the boarding house, usually arriving just as dinner was finishing. He would accept a cup of coffee from Mrs. Fincher and sit on the porch with Thalia and whoever else was present, discussing the day's events or sharing stories of his adventures enforcing the law across the territory. Thalia found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She told herself it was natural to feel drawn to the man who had saved her, but in her heart, she knew it was more than gratitude that made her pulse quicken when she heard his spurs jangling on the porch steps. On a warm Tuesday evening in late May, Justice arrived later than usual, his expression grave. He declined Mrs. Fincher's offer of coffee and asked to speak with Thalia privately. We can use the parlor, Mrs. Fincher offered, her usually stern face softening with concern. The other ladies are in the garden. Once they were alone, Justice wasted no time. Your brother was spotted in town today. Thalia felt the blood drain from her face. Here? In Redemption? Justice nodded. Mr. Peterson saw him lurking near the livery stable around noon. By the time word reached me, he'd vanished. Do you think he knows I'm here? At the boarding house. It's possible. Redemption isn't that large, and your presence has been noted. Justice ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. I've doubled the patrols and alerted everyone to be on the lookout, but I'd feel better if you weren't alone. I'm hardly alone here, Thalia pointed out. There are 12 women in this house. 12 women with no protection beyond locked doors, Justice countered. Vernon is desperate and dangerous, and if Blackwood is with him. Thalia shivered despite the warm evening. What do you suggest? Justice hesitated. I've spoken with Mrs. Fincher. She agrees that until we locate your brother, it might be safer if you stayed somewhere less predictable. Where? My house, he said simply. It's on the edge of town, set back from the road. I have a spare room, and no one would expect to find you there. Thalia stared at him, shocked by the suggestion. But the impropriety. Mrs. Fincher has agreed to act as chaperone, Justice added quickly. She would stay with you during the day while I'm working, and I'd be there at night. You've thought this through, Thalia observed. It's my job to think about safety, he replied, though there was something in his eyes that suggested his concerns went beyond professional duty. Thalia considered the proposal. The idea of staying in Justice's home sent a flutter of nervous excitement through her, but she was practical enough to recognize the wisdom of his plan. If Vernon was truly looking for her, the boarding house would be the obvious place to start. All right, she agreed finally. If Mrs. Fincher approves, I'll come, but only until Vernon is caught. Relief washed over Justice's features. Thank you. I'll feel better knowing you're safe. He stood, adjusting his hat. Pack whatever you need. I'll return at nightfall to escort you. After he left, Thalia climbed the stairs to her small room, her mind racing. The prospect of staying in Sheriff Justice's home was both terrifying and thrilling. What would it be like to see him in the early morning hours, perhaps unshaven and tousled from sleep? To share meals across a table meant for family, not boarders? Mrs. Fincher appeared in the doorway as Thalia was folding dresses into her carpet bag. The sheriff explained the situation, she said. It's most irregular, but these are unusual circumstances. Thalia looked up anxiously. You don't think people will talk? Mrs. Fincher's lips twitched in a rare smile. My dear, people in Redemption have been talking since the day Sheriff Justice carried you out of Blackwood's saloon. This will simply give them fresh material. I don't want to damage his reputation, Thalia said, genuinely concerned. Or yours, for serving as chaperone. Sheriff Justice's reputation can withstand a few wagging tongues, Mrs. Fincher assured her. As for mine, I've lived in this town for 30 years. Anyone who questions my propriety will find themselves without my apple pie at the next church social, a punishment few are willing to risk. The older woman's confidence eased some of Thalia's concerns, and she continued packing with more determination. By the time Justice returned, she was ready, her few possessions neatly stored in the carpet bag and a shawl draped over her shoulders against the evening chill. Justice's house proved to be a modest but well-built cabin about a quarter-mile from the edge of town, set among a stand of cottonwood trees that provided shade and privacy. Inside was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and bookshelves filled with volumes that surprised Thalia with their variety. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a small kitchen at the back. It's not much, Justice said, watching her take it all in. But it's quiet. It's lovely, Thalia replied honestly. Did you build it yourself? He nodded. When I first took the job as sheriff. Needed a place where I could leave the badge by the door sometimes. Mrs. Fincher bustled in behind them, immediately taking charge. I'll make up the spare room. Sheriff, perhaps you could start a fire? The evenings are still cool. As Mrs. Fincher disappeared down the hallway, Thalia wandered to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines. You have quite a collection. Reading passes the time on quiet nights, Justice said, kneeling by the fireplace to arrange kindling. Feel free to borrow anything that interests you. Thalia pulled out a volume of poetry Wordsworth and leafed through it with surprise. I wouldn't have taken you for a poetry man, Sheriff. A hint of color touched his cheeks. There's a lot you don't know about me, Miss Dawson. The simple statement hung in the air between them, an invitation and a challenge that made Thalia's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Mrs. Fincher returned. The room is ready, she announced. Now, Sheriff, I've brought some soup and bread for dinner. I'll just heat it up, and then we can discuss the arrangements for tomorrow. Over the simple but delicious meal, they worked out a schedule. Mrs. Fincher would arrive early each morning and stay until Justice returned from his duties. Thalia would continue to help with the boarding house laundry and cooking, but she would do so from here, with Mrs. Fincher bringing the work to her. It won't be for long, Justice assured her, seeing her expression. Just until we catch Vernon. And if you don't, Thalia asked quietly. Justice's expression hardened. We will. Men like your brother make mistakes. He's desperate, and desperate men get careless. After dinner, Mrs. Fincher prepared to leave, promising to return at dawn. Justice insisted on escorting her back to the boarding house, leaving Thalia alone in the cabin with strict instructions to lock the door behind them and open it for no one but himself. Alone in the quiet house, Thalia explored more freely. The spare bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the trees. She unpacked her few belongings, then, curiosity getting the better of her, peeked into Justice's room across the hall. His bedroom was as austere as she had imagined, a larger bed with a plain quilt, a battered trunk at its foot, a desk with papers neatly stacked. The only personal touch was a small framed photograph on the bedside table. Thalia stepped closer to see it, a younger Justice in his sheriff's clothes, standing beside a pretty woman with a gentle smile. His fiancée, Thalia guessed, feeling a pang of something that might have been jealousy. She retreated quickly, feeling like an intruder. Back in the main room, she selected a book from the shelf, a novel she had heard of but never read, and settled into a chair by the fire to wait for Justice's return. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around her like a blanket, so different from the constant bustle of the boarding house. In the distance, an owl called, and the fire crackled companionably in the hearth. Despite the circumstances that had brought her here, Thalia felt a sense of peace steal over her. When Justice returned, he found her dozing in the chair, the book open in her lap. He paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her bathed in firelight, her auburn hair coming loose from its pins, her face relaxed in sleep. Something tightened in his chest, a feeling he had tried to deny since the day he first saw her in Blackwood's saloon. He must have made some sound, for Thalia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked confused, then smiled sleepily at the sight of him. You're back, she murmured, straightening in the chair. Is Mrs. Fincher safely home? Safe and sound, he confirmed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. And lecturing me the entire way about proper behavior under my roof. Thalia laughed softly. I can imagine. Justice moved to the fire, adding another log. You should get some rest. It's been a long day. She nodded, marking her place in the book and rising from the chair. At the entrance to the hallway, she paused. Sheriff Yorick, thank you. For everything. In the flickering firelight, their eyes met and held. You don't need to thank me, Thalia, he said quietly. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. The simple sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. Good night, she whispered, and fled to the safety of her room before she could do something foolish like step into his arms and discover if his embrace was as strong and comforting as she imagined it would be. Behind the closed door, Thalia pressed a hand to her racing heart. Whatever was growing between her and Sheriff Justice, it was becoming harder to ignore. And trapped together in this cabin, with danger lurking outside, she wasn't sure how long either of them could continue to pretend it was merely friendship or duty that bound them together. For 3 days, the arrangement worked smoothly. Mrs. Fincher arrived each morning with laundry or baking from the boarding house, keeping Thalia busy and providing cheerful company. Justice returned each evening, sometimes bringing news of the search for Vernon, sometimes just tired and grateful for the hot meal waiting for him. They fell into a domestic routine that felt both strange and surprisingly natural. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Justice cleaning his guns or reviewing wanted posters, Thalia sewing, or reading from his collection of books. They talked easily, sharing stories of their pasts, discovering shared interests and opinions. Thalia learned that Justice had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, seeking a fresh start like so many others. He had worn a badge for almost 12 years, first as a deputy in Colorado, then as sheriff in various towns across the territory before settling in Redemption 5 years ago. In turn, she told him about growing up on the farm in Kansas, her father's dreams of prosperity, her mother's gentle wisdom. She spoke of the hard years after their deaths, trying to keep the farm going while Vernon increasingly turned to gambling and drink for solace. "I should have seen what was happening," she admitted one evening. "There were signs money missing, strangers visiting the farm when I was working in the fields. But I didn't want to believe Vernon could fall so far. We often don't see the worst in those we love until it's too late," Justice said, his voice gentle with understanding. The conversation turned to lighter topics than books they had both read, places they hoped to visit someday, childhood adventures. By the time they retired to their separate rooms each night, Thalia felt as though she had known Yorick Justice all her life rather than just a few short weeks. On the fourth morning, Mrs. Fincher arrived with troubling news. "There was an incident at the saloon last night," she announced as she helped Thalia prepare breakfast. "A stranger asking questions about you and the sheriff. Got into a fight with Mr. Donovan when he wouldn't talk." Thalia nearly dropped the eggs she was cracking into a bowl. "Was it Vernon?" "No one recognized him from the descriptions," Mrs. Fincher said. "But he vanished before the deputy could question him. Sheriff Justice is investigating this morning." A sense of foreboding settled over Thalia. The peaceful routine of the past few days had almost made her forget the danger that had brought her to Justice's cabin. Now reality intruded once more. "Did the man say what he wanted?" she asked. Mrs. Fincher shook her head. "Just kept asking where you were staying and whether the sheriff had a special interest in you. Offered money for information." "Blackwood," Thalia whispered. "It has to be. Vernon wouldn't have money to offer." "That's what the sheriff thinks too," Mrs. Fincher confirmed grimly. "He asked me to tell you not to step foot outside today, no matter what. He's doubled the patrols around this area." The day passed with excruciating slowness. Thalia tried to focus on the mending Mrs. Fincher had brought, but her thoughts kept returning to the stranger in the saloon and what his presence might mean. Was Blackwood seeking revenge for the humiliation Justice had dealt him? Or was he still hoping to collect on Vernon's debt by reclaiming Thalia? Justice returned earlier than usual, his expression grim. "The stranger from the saloon was definitely one of Blackwood's men," he said without preamble. "He was seen meeting with 2 others at the edge of town before they all rode out." "They're gone?" Thalia asked hopefully. "For now, but they'll be back." Justice removed his gun belt and hung it on a peg near the door. "We found tracks suggesting they've been watching the house." Mrs. Fincher gasped. "You mean they know Miss Dawson is here?" "It seems likely." Justice ran a hand through his hair in that now familiar gesture of frustration. "We need to move her again." "Where?" Thalia asked, her voice small. "If they found me here, they could find me anywhere in Redemption." Justice exchanged a look with Mrs. Fincher. "I've been thinking about that. There's a ranch about 10 miles outside of town, the Circle J. It belongs to my friend James Cooper. He and his wife would take you in, and no one would think to look for you there. You want to send me away?" Thalia couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. Justice's expression softened. "Just until we catch Blackwood and your brother. Cooper's ranch is remote, well defended, and his wife would welcome the company." "When?" Thalia asked, already knowing she had little choice. "Tonight. After dark." Justice moved to the window, peering out at the lengthening shadows. "Cooper is sending a wagon for supplies. You'll hide among the crates." Mrs. Fincher placed a comforting hand on Thalia's arm. "It's for the best, dear. Just for a little while." Thalia nodded, fighting back tears. She had grown accustomed to the cabin, to the quiet evenings with Justice, to feeling almost like she belonged somewhere again. Now she would be uprooted once more, sent to strangers for her own protection. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly, and retreated to the spare bedroom. She had just finished placing the last of her dresses in the carpet bag when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching outside. Voices murmured in the main room, Justice and Mrs. Fincher greeting the newcomer, presumably Cooper's ranch hand. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Thalia picked up her bag and stepped into the hallway. She had reached the entrance to the main room when the voices suddenly changed tone, a shout from Justice, a scream from Mrs. Fincher, and then a voice that made Thalia's blood run cold. "Where is she, Justice? Where's my sister? Vernon?" Thalia froze in the hallway, her heart pounding. Through the partially open door, she could see Justice standing rigidly in the center of the room, his hands raised slightly. Mrs. Fincher was pressed against the far wall, her face pale with terror. And there, holding a revolver pointed steadily at Justice's chest, stood her brother. Vernon looked worse than when she had last seen him, thinner, his clothes filthy, his face unshaven and haggard. But his eyes burned with a desperate intensity that frightened Thalia more than the gun in his hand. "She's not here," Justice said calmly. "We moved her days ago when we heard you were in town." Vernon laughed harshly. "You're lying. The old woman from the boarding house comes here every day. My sister's here somewhere." He raised his voice. "Thalia, come out now, or I put a bullet in the sheriff's heart." Thalia's mind raced. Justice's gun belt hung by the door, too far for him to reach. There was a rifle mounted above the fireplace, but Vernon would shoot before either of them could get to it. She had no weapon, nothing to help turn the tide, except herself. Drawing a deep breath, she stepped into the doorway. "I'm here, Vernon." All eyes turned to her. Justice's face tightened with dismay, while Vernon split into a triumphant grin. "There you are, little sister," he said, his gun still trained on Justice. "We've got unfinished business, you and I." "Let them go," Thalia said steadily. "Whatever you want with me, they're not part of it." Vernon's grin widened. "Oh, but the sheriff is very much part of it. He cost me a lot of money when he took you away from Blackwood. And now Blackwood wants both of you." "Blackwood?" Justice asked sharply. "Where is he?" "Waiting," Vernon replied. "He's got plans for you, Sheriff. Seems you've been a thorn in his side for years. And as for my sister," his eyes raked over Thalia with calculating assessment, "he still thinks she might fetch a good price down in Mexico. Or maybe he'll keep her for himself. He wasn't too clear on that part." Thalia felt sick. "You'd sell me again? Your own sister?" Something like shame flickered briefly in Vernon's eyes before hardening once more. "I'm in too deep, Thalia. Blackwood owns me now. It's you or me." "It doesn't have to be either," Justice said, his voice level and reasonable. "Put down the gun, Vernon. We can work something out." Vernon laughed bitterly. "Like a nice sell for the next 10 years? No thanks." He gestured with the gun. "Both of you, move over there with the old woman. We're going to wait for Blackwood, and then we'll all take a little trip together." Thalia caught Justice's eye as she moved slowly across the room. There was a calmness in his gaze that steadied her, a silent message that told her to be ready. For what? She wasn't sure, but she trusted him. They stood together against the wall, Justice, Thalia, and Mrs. Fincher, who was trembling visibly now. Vernon kept the gun pointed at them, pacing nervously near the door. "How long until Blackwood gets here?" Justice asked conversationally, as if inquiring about the arrival of a dinner guest. "Soon enough," Vernon snapped. "He was right behind me." As if on cue, the sound of approaching horses broke the tense silence. Vernon's face lit with relief. "That'll be him now." But Justice smiled, a small, satisfied expression that made Vernon's confidence falter. "I don't think so," he said quietly. The door burst open, and 3 men rushed in with guns drawn. Justice's deputies, Thalia realized with a surge of hope. Vernon whirled, firing wildly. A deputy fell with a cry of pain, but the other 2 returned fire. Vernon staggered as bullets struck him, his gun clattering to the floor as he collapsed. In the chaos, Justice shoved Thalia and Mrs. Fincher behind the heavy oak table, flipping it on its side to create a barricade. He lunged for his gun belt, drawing his revolver with practiced speed. More shots rang out from outside, a firefight erupting in the yard. Through the open door, Thalia could see flashes of gunfire and shadowy figures moving in the gathering dusk. "Blackwood," Justice muttered. "Stay down," he ordered Thalia and Mrs. Fincher before crouching low and moving toward the wounded deputy. The man was alive but bleeding heavily from a shoulder wound. Justice dragged him behind the barricade of the table, then tore a strip from his own shirt to create a makeshift bandage. "How many?" he asked the injured man. 5, maybe 6, the deputy gasped through pain. "We got word from Cooper's ranch hand that someone had ambushed him on the road. Figured they might be coming here next. Justice nodded grimly. You did good. He turned to Thalia. Keep pressure on his wound. She pressed her hands against the blood-soaked bandage, trying not to flinch at the deputy's groan of pain. Justice moved to the window, staying low as he peered out. They're pulling back, he reported, regrouping behind the trees. Mrs. Fincher, who had been silent with shock until now, suddenly pointed a shaking finger. Vernon, she whispered. Thalia followed her gaze to where her brother lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Despite everything he had done, a wave of grief washed over her. He had been her only family, and once, long ago, he had been the protective older brother who taught her to ride and fish and whistle through a blade of grass. Is he? She couldn't finish the question. Justice moved cautiously to Vernon's side, checking for signs of life. His expression when he looked back at Thalia told her everything. She closed her eyes briefly, accepting this final severing of her past. A voice called from outside. Justice, send out the girl, and we'll let you live. Blackwood, Justice confirmed, his jaw tightening. He moved back to the barricade. One of you needs to get to town for reinforcements, he told his deputies. The back window in my bedroom, you can slip out that way. The uninjured deputy nodded and disappeared down the hall, while Justice returned to the window. You're surrounded, Blackwood, he shouted. My men have gone for reinforcements. You've got about 15 minutes to clear out before half the town arrives with guns. A harsh laugh answered him. You're bluffing, Justice. We've been watching. There's just you and 2 deputies, one of them bleeding out if I'm not mistaken. The standoff continued as darkness fell completely. Justice moved efficiently around the cabin, extinguishing lamps to make them less visible targets, positioning Mrs. Fincher and Thalia in the most protected corner, checking the wounded deputy's bandage. What's the plan? Thalia whispered when he crouched beside her. Wait for help, he replied simply. Cooper's ranch isn't far. When his hand doesn't return, he'll send men to investigate. And if Blackwood attacks before then? Justice's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing gently. Then we fight. But I promise you, Thalia, I won't let him take you. The certainty in his voice steadied her. She returned the pressure of his hand, drawing strength from his touch. I know. For what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they waited in tense silence, broken occasionally by shouts from Blackwood or the wounded deputy's labored breathing. The fire had died down to embers, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. Then came the sound they had been waiting for, horses approaching fast from the direction of town, many of them. Shouts of alarm rose from Blackwood's men. That'll be Cooper and half the men in Redemption, Justice said with satisfaction. Blackwood's about to discover he's the one who's surrounded. More gunfire erupted outside, but it was brief. Soon they heard a familiar voice calling. Sheriff Justice. You alive in there? We're here, Cooper. Justice shouted back, relief evident in his voice. Careful, we've got wounded. The next hour passed in a blur for Thalia. Cooper and his men, along with several townspeople who had joined the rescue party, secured the area. Blackwood had been captured alive, though 2 of his men were dead and another wounded. The injured deputy was carried carefully to a wagon to be taken back to town for the doctor's attention. Vernon's body was covered with a blanket, a detail that brought a fresh wave of grief to Thalia despite everything. Justice had been right, her brother had made one mistake too many, and it had cost him his life. Mrs. Fincher, remarkably composed given the circumstances, insisted on returning to the boarding house to prepare rooms for Cooper's men. They'll need a place to sleep after all this excitement, she declared, her practical nature reasserting itself now that the danger had passed, which left Thalia and Justice alone in the cabin, surveying the damage, overturned furniture, broken glass, bloodstains on the wooden floor. In the aftermath of violence, the cozy home seemed violated, its peace shattered. I'm sorry about your brother, Justice said quietly, watching as Thalia knelt beside the covered form. So am I, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. He wasn't always like this. After our parents died, something broke in him. I kept hoping he'd find his way back. Justice moved to her side, helping her to her feet. Some men can't find their way back once they've gone too far down a dark path. And Blackwood? She asked. He'll hang, Justice said simply. He's wanted for murder in 2 territories, besides everything else. Thalia nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. It was over. The danger that had shadowed her since that terrible day in Blackwood's saloon had passed. Vernon was gone, Blackwood captured. She was truly free. But free to do what? The question hung unspoken between them as they worked together to restore order to the cabin, righting furniture, sweeping up broken glass, building up the fire once more. When the main room was as tidy as they could make it under the circumstances, Justice turned to Thalia. You should get some rest. It's been a long day. I'm not sure I could sleep, she admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see Vernon falling. Justice hesitated, then moved to a cabinet near the bookshelf. He returned with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. This helps sometimes, he said, pouring a small amount into each glass. Not too much, mind. Just enough to take the edge off. Thalia accepted the glass, sipping cautiously. The liquor burned her throat, but there was a warmth that followed, easing some of the tension from her body. They sat in companionable silence by the rekindled fire, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Justice spoke. What will you do now? It was the question Thalia had been asking herself. I don't know, she admitted. Stay at the boarding house for a while, I suppose. Keep working for Mrs. Fincher. Beyond that. She shrugged. I haven't thought that far ahead. Justice nodded, his eyes on the fire. You could go anywhere, do anything. You're young, educated, capable. Are you trying to get rid of me, Sheriff? Thalia asked, attempting a lightness she didn't feel. His head jerked up, his expression startled. No, not at all. I just meant, you have options now. Do I? She asked softly, gathering her courage. Because the truth is, Yorick, there's really only one place I want to be. Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Thalia saw in his gaze the same longing that had been growing in her heart, a need for connection, for belonging, for love. Thalia, he began, his voice rough with emotion, I'm not a young man. I've lived a hard life, seen things that wake me in the night. I wear a badge that makes me a target for every outlaw with a grudge. I can't offer you the kind of life you deserve. Why don't you let me decide what I deserve? She countered. I'm not as fragile as you think, Yorick. I've survived my own share of hardships. He set down his glass and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. When I first saw you in that saloon, something happened to me. Something I can't explain. It was like recognizing someone I'd been looking for without knowing it. Thalia's heart quickened. I felt it too. But I was afraid, he continued, that what I felt was wrong somehow, that I was taking advantage of your situation, that your gratitude might be coloring your feelings. Is that what you think this is? Thalia asked, a hint of anger in her voice. Gratitude. Justice shook his head slowly. No, not anymore. Not after these weeks of getting to know you, your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. What I feel for you goes far beyond admiration or protectiveness. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. I love you, Thalia Dawson. I think I have since the moment I walked into that saloon and heard your brother trying to sell you to Blackwood. When I said you were worth more than gold to me, I meant it even then, before I knew you. Tears welled in Thalia's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. I love you too, she whispered, and not out of gratitude or confusion or any other reason you might imagine. I love you for who you are, the man who treats everyone with dignity, who reads poetry by firelight, who risks his life for justice because it's the right thing to do. Justice's hands tightened on hers. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. You've been through too much. Take time to think. I don't need time. Thalia interrupted, her voice firm with certainty. I've had weeks to think about what I want, Yorick. And it's you. It's this life, here in redemption. A smile broke across his face, not the small, contained smile she was accustomed to, but a full expression of joy that transformed his features. He rose, drawing her up with him, and finally, took her in his arms. His kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he still feared she might change her mind. But when Thalia responded with all the love and longing she had been holding back, his restraint crumbled. His arms tightened around her, one hand cradling the back of her head as the kiss deepened into something that made her dizzy with happiness. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Justice rested his forehead against hers. I'm never letting you go, he murmured. Not for all the gold in the territory. Thalia smiled, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "I'm holding you to that promise, Sheriff." Outside, the night was calm again, the stars bright in the clear desert sky. Inside Justice's cabin, their cabin, now a new future was taking shape, built on the ashes of a painful past, but glowing with the promise of love that had found its way against all odds. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, the church in Redemption was filled to capacity for a wedding that the town had been anticipating for weeks. Townspeople crowded the pews, craning their necks for a glimpse of the bride as she walked down the aisle on the arm of James Cooper, who had proudly agreed to give her away. Thalia Dawson wore a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Peterson had worked on for months, determined that the sheriff's bride would have the finest wedding dress Redemption had ever seen. Her auburn hair was crowned with a wreath of autumn flowers, and her face glowed with happiness as she approached the altar where Yorick Justice waited, looking both solemn and radiant in a new black suit. Mrs. Fincher, seated in the front pew, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. In the months since the shootout at Justice's cabin, she had become something of a mother figure to Thalia, guiding her through the preparations for the wedding and sharing wisdom about married life that occasionally made the younger woman blush. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. When Justice repeated the vows, his voice carried clearly through the church. "I, Yorick, take thee, Thalia, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Thalia's response was equally firm, her eyes never leaving his as she pledged her life to the man who had saved her in more ways than one. When Reverend Simmons pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers. Justice swept Thalia into his arms for a kiss that was perhaps a bit more passionate than strictly proper for a church setting, but no one seemed to mind. This was a love story that had captured the imagination of the entire town, the brave sheriff and the woman he had declared more valuable than gold. The celebration afterward spilled out onto the town square, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by every household in Redemption. There was dancing to fiddle music, children running and playing, and enough goodwill to make the day feel magical. As evening approached, Justice found his bride sitting with Mrs. Fincher, watching the festivities with contented smiles. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Justice?" he asked, extending his hand with a formal bow that made Thalia laugh. "I'm still getting used to that name," she admitted as he led her to the area cleared for dancing. "Mrs. Justice, it sounds so official. It suits you," he said, drawing her into his arms as the musicians began a waltz. "Almost as much as you suit me." They moved together with the easy harmony that had characterized their relationship from the beginning, despite the rocky start. The past 6 months had seen them building a life together, expanding the cabin to include a proper kitchen and parlor, planting a small garden for the spring, becoming a respected couple in the community of Redemption. There had been challenges, of course. The nightmares that sometimes woke Thalia, filled with images of Vernon's final moments or the terror of Blackwood's threats. The occasional danger that came with Justice's badge, like the time he'd been gone for 3 days tracking a gang of cattle rustlers, returning with a bullet graze on his arm that had terrified Thalia more than she cared to admit. But there had been joy too: quiet evenings reading by the fire, Sunday picnics by the creek that ran behind their property, the gradual healing of old wounds as they shared their pasts and dreamed of their future. "What are you thinking about?" Justice asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "How far we've come," she replied. "This time last year, I was trying to save our failing farm while Vernon gambled away what little we had. I never imagined I'd be here, dancing at my own wedding to the most honorable man I've ever known." Justice's arms tightened around her. "Life has a way of surprising us," he agreed. "When I pinned on this badge years ago, I never thought it would lead me to you." As the dance ended, he kept hold of her hand. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her away from the crowd toward the edge of the square where their horses were tethered. "Now? We can't leave our own wedding celebration," Thalia protested, though she followed willingly enough. "Just for a little while," he assured her. "We'll be back before they miss us." Curious, Thalia allowed him to help her mount her mare, adjusting her wedding dress as best she could for riding. They set off at an easy pace, heading west out of town toward their home. But instead of turning down the familiar path to their cabin, Justice led them a bit further to a rise overlooking a small valley that Thalia had admired on their Sunday rides. Here, the view stretched for miles, the town of Redemption nestled against the mountains to the east, the river winding through the valley below, and to the west, open country dotted with cottonwoods and mesquite. Justice dismounted and helped Thalia down, then led her to the crest of the hill. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the valley below. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "I've always loved this spot." "I know." He smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression that intrigued her. "That's why I bought it." Thalia stared at him. "You what?" 20 acres, including this hilltop and the valley below." He pointed to a spot near a cluster of trees. "I thought we might build a house there, where we can see the sunrise over the mountains. There's good water from the creek, and the soil's rich enough for a proper garden, maybe an orchard eventually." Thalia was speechless. "But the cabin, your job in town." "I'm not giving up the badge," he assured her. "Not yet, anyway. But I thought, someday, when there are children." He faltered, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you prefer staying closer to town?" "I should have asked first." Thalia silenced him with a kiss, rising on tiptoe to reach his lips. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. "It's perfect," she said. "All of it. The land, the future you're imagining for us, it's everything I could want." Relief and joy washed over his face. "I want to build something that will last, Thalia. Something more than just enforcing the law or chasing outlaws. A legacy of peace and growth, not just order. We'll build it together," she promised, slipping her arm around his waist as they looked out over what would someday be their home. They stood together as the sun began to set, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of music and laughter from the town, their friends and neighbors celebrating not just their marriage but the sense of community that had flourished in Redemption. "We should get back," Thalia said reluctantly. "Mrs. Fincher will send out a search party if the bride and groom disappear for too long." Justice laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in the months since Thalia had come into his life. She would at that. As they mounted their horses for the ride back to town, Thalia took one last look at the valley that would someday be their homestead. From desperate beginnings, a woman sold to pay a debt, a lawman haunted by past failures, they had found their way to this moment of perfect promise. "Ready, Mrs. Justice?" Yorick called, his horse already turning toward town. "Ready," Thalia replied with absolute certainty. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, a partnership forged in crisis, but built to last through all the seasons of their lives. As they rode side by side back toward the lights of Redemption, Thalia reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. Her brother's betrayal, meant to destroy her, had instead led her to a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. In trying to sell her for gold, Vernon had inadvertently delivered her to the one man who recognized her true worth of value beyond price, measured not in coins, but in the currency of the heart. And in that knowledge, Thalia found a peace that no amount of gold could ever buy.